Have you ever been in a room full of people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, only to have them tear you down in the most humiliating way possible? Have you ever felt your stomach drop, your face burn with shame, and your heart shatter into a million pieces while everyone around you laughed like it was the funniest joke they'd ever heard? That's exactly what happened to me during what I thought would be just another ordinary family gathering. And let me tell you, that single moment changed the entire trajectory of my relationship with my family forever. I'm talking about the kind of change that doesn't just fade away with time, the kind that fundamentally alters who you are and how you see the people you've known your entire life. My name doesn't really matter for this story, but what does matter is what I do for a living, because that became the center of the most painful experience I've ever had with the people who raised me. I work as a social media manager, and before you roll your eyes or think that's not a real job, let me stop you right there because that's exactly what my family did, and it nearly destroyed me. For years, I'd been building my career in digital marketing, working with brands, creating content strategies, managing campaigns that actually generated real revenue for real businesses. I was proud of what I did. I was good at it. I made decent money. I had creative freedom, and I was helping businesses grow in the modern economy. But to my family, especially to my Uncle Robert and my cousin Jennifer, I was basically just playing on my phone all day and calling it work. They never understood it, never tried to understand it, and honestly, I'd grown accustomed to the subtle digs and the condescending smiles whenever I talked about my job at family dinners. What I wasn't prepared for was the absolute annihilation of my dignity that happened on that warm Saturday afternoon in September, when we all gathered at my parents' house for what was supposed to be a celebration of my grandmother's 80th birthday. The house was packed with relatives I hadn't seen in months, some I hadn't seen in years. And there was that familiar buzzing energy that comes with big family gatherings, that mixture of genuine warmth and underlying tension that seems to exist in every extended family. I had actually been looking forward to this day because I'd recently landed a huge client, a national retail chain that wanted me to completely overhaul their social media presence, and it was honestly the biggest professional achievement of my career up to that point. I was feeling confident, proud, and maybe a little bit eager to share my success with people who'd known me since I was in diapers. That was my first mistake. We were all gathered in the backyard, the late afternoon sun casting that golden light that makes everything look like a memory even while it's happening, and the smell of grilled meat was mixing with my aunt's famous potato salad and my mother's homemade lemonade. Everyone was laughing, sharing stories, and catching up on each other's lives, and I remember feeling genuinely happy to be there, surrounded by the chaos and comfort of family. My Uncle Robert, who's always been the loudest voice in any room he enters, was holding court near the grill, telling some exaggerated story about a business deal he'd closed. And my cousin Jennifer, who works as a corporate lawyer and never lets anyone forget it, was standing next to him with that superior smile she always wears when she's around family. Somehow, the conversation shifted to careers and what everyone was doing professionally, and I should have seen it coming. I really should have. But I was naive enough to think that maybe, just maybe, they'd be happy for me when I shared my news. When my aunt asked me how work was going, I made my second mistake. I told the truth. I said I was doing great, that I'd just signed a major client, and that my business was growing faster than I'd ever imagined possible. For a brief moment, maybe 2 or 3 seconds, there was genuine interest in people's faces, and then my Uncle Robert, with his booming voice and his absolute certainty that his opinion was the only one that mattered, decided to turn my moment of pride into a public execution of my career choice, my intelligence, and my worth as a contributing member of society. He laughed first, this deep, dismissive laugh that immediately made my stomach clench, and then he said, loud enough for everyone in that backyard to hear, that I was basically just getting paid to scroll through Instagram all day, and that calling myself a business owner was like calling someone who plays video games a professional athlete. The words hit me like physical blows, each one landing with precision on the parts of me that were already vulnerable, already questioning whether I was really doing enough, really contributing enough, really worthy enough. But he wasn't done, not even close. He went on to say that when he was my age, he was working real jobs with real responsibilities, that social media was just a fad for teenagers and unemployed people with too much time on their hands, and that I should really think about getting serious about my future before it was too late. The backyard, which had been full of conversation and laughter just seconds before, went quiet in that awful way that tells you everyone heard what just happened, and they're all watching to see how you'll react. I felt my face burning, felt tears threatening to spill over, felt my throat closing up with humiliation and rage, and hurt so profound I couldn't even form words to defend myself. And then, as if the universe decided I hadn't suffered enough, My cousin Jennifer jumped in with her perfectly manicured hand gestures and her condescending tone to agree with her father, saying that she didn't really consider what I did to be a real career either, that it was fine as a hobby or a side hustle, but that maybe I should consider going back to school for something more substantial, something with a future, something that people could actually respect. She said this while looking at me with what I can only describe as pity mixed with superiority, like she was doing me a favor by pointing out how inadequate my life choices were. I looked around desperately, hoping someone, anyone, would jump to my defense, would tell them they were being cruel and unfair, would acknowledge that what I did required skill and creativity and business acumen and countless hours of hard work. My mother was looking at her plate. My father was suddenly very interested in his drink. My younger brother was scrolling through his phone, pretending he couldn't hear what was happening. Not one single person in that backyard full of relatives who claimed to love me said a word in my defense. The silence was its own kind of violence, a collective decision to let me drown while they all stood safely on the shore and watched. I don't remember what I said in response, if I said anything at all. I think I mumbled something about needing to use the bathroom, and I escaped into the house, my vision blurry with unshed tears, my hands shaking so badly I could barely open the door. I locked myself in the bathroom and finally let the tears fall. And they weren't just tears about what had happened in the backyard. They were tears for every single time my family had dismissed my choices, minimized my achievements, and made me feel like I was somehow less than everyone else because I'd chosen a different path. I cried for the little girl I used to be who thought her family would always be her biggest supporters, and I cried for the woman I'd become who'd just learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. I stayed in that bathroom for 20 minutes, trying to pull myself together, trying to convince myself that I could go back out there and finish the party with my dignity intact. But every time I thought I was ready, a fresh wave of humiliation would wash over me, and I'd have to start the process all over again. When I finally emerged, I avoided everyone, helped my mother clean up in silence, and left as soon as it was socially acceptable to do so. Probably even before that, if I'm being honest. The drive home was a blur of tears and replaying the scene over and over in my head, thinking of all the things I should have said, all the ways I should have defended myself, all the statistics and success stories and proof I could have thrown in their faces to show them they were wrong about me and my career. But deep down, I knew that no amount of proof would have mattered because this wasn't really about my job at all. This was about something much deeper, something about their need to feel superior, their fear of anything they didn't understand, their discomfort with anyone who colored outside the lines of what they considered acceptable and normal and worthy of respect. That night, lying in my bed staring at the ceiling, something shifted inside me, something fundamental and irreversible. I realized that I'd been seeking validation from people who were never going to give it to me, that I'd been shrinking myself to fit into their narrow definition of success, and that I'd been accepting their judgment as if it had any bearing on my actual worth as a human being. The humiliation I'd felt in that backyard was real and painful and completely justified, but underneath it was something else, something that felt almost like relief, like I'd finally been given permission to stop trying so hard to make them understand, stop desperately seeking their approval, stop showing up to gatherings where I was always going to be the punchline to someone's joke. I thought about all the times I'd sat through dinners where my uncle dominated conversations with his outdated business philosophies, where my cousin bragged about her billable hours while looking down on anyone who didn't work in corporate law, where my achievements were met with polite disinterest, while everyone else's were celebrated with genuine enthusiasm. I thought about how exhausted I was from always being on the defensive, always having to prove myself, always feeling like I was one sarcastic comment away from complete humiliation. And in that moment, staring at the shadows on my ceiling, I made a decision that would change everything. I decided I was done. I was done attending family events where I wasn't valued. I was done subjecting myself to their criticism and judgment. I was done pretending that their opinions mattered more than my own sense of self-worth. I was done sacrificing my peace of mind for the sake of maintaining family harmony that only seemed to apply when I was the one being asked to swallow my hurt and show up with a smile. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like jumping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. I knew there would be consequences. I knew they'd call me dramatic and sensitive and ungrateful. I knew my mother would be upset and my father would be disappointed. But for the first time in my life, I prioritized my own emotional well-being over their comfort. And that single shift in perspective was more powerful than anything else I'd ever experienced. The days following my grandmother's birthday party were strange and heavy, filled with a kind of grief I wasn't expecting. I kept replaying that moment in the backyard, dissecting every word, every facial expression, every painful second of silence from the people who should have defended me. I was grieving not just for what happened, but for the realization of what had always been true, but I'd been too hopeful or too naive to fully accept. My family didn't respect me, didn't value what I did, and probably never would. That's a hard truth to swallow when you're talking about the people who raised you, who were there for your first day of school and your graduation, and every milestone in between. How do you reconcile loving people with the reality that they don't see you, don't understand you, and don't particularly seem interested in trying? I threw myself into my work with an intensity that surprised even me, partially because it was the one place I felt competent and valued, and partially because staying busy meant I didn't have to sit with the uncomfortable emotions churning inside me. My new client, the national retail chain I'd mentioned at that disastrous party, was thrilled with the initial strategy I'd presented, and we were already seeing engagement rates that exceeded their expectations. Every notification of a successful campaign, every positive feedback from the client, every increase in followers and conversion rates felt like proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I did mattered, that I was actually good at something even if my family refused to see it. But success at work couldn't completely fill the hollow feeling that had taken up residence in my chest, this aching sense of loss for something I wasn't even sure I'd ever truly had. About a week after the party, my phone lit up with a text from my mother asking why I'd been so quiet and if everything was okay. I stared at that message for a long time, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard, trying to decide how honest I wanted to be. Part of me wanted to pretend everything was fine, to smooth it over and move on like nothing had happened, because that's what we'd always done in my family. We swept things under the rug and pretended the lumps weren't there. But another part of me, the part that was still raw and hurt and angry, wanted her to know exactly why I wasn't okay, wanted her to acknowledge what had happened and how it had affected me. I ended up writing something in between, telling her I'd been busy with work and that I needed some space to process things, which was true even if it wasn't the whole truth. Her response came quickly, just a simple, "Okay, honey, let me know if you need anything." And while I appreciated the sentiment, what I really needed was for someone in my family to have stood up for me when it mattered. And that moment had already passed. The next family event was my cousin's engagement party, scheduled for 3 weeks after the birthday disaster. And I knew this would be my first real test. Would I actually follow through on my decision to stop attending? Or would guilt and obligation pull me back into the pattern I'd been stuck in my whole life? The invitation came via a family group chat, one of those chaotic threads where everyone talks over each other with excessive punctuation and too many emojis, and I watched the messages pile up with a strange sense of detachment, like I was observing my family from a distance rather than being part of it. My mother mentioned that we should coordinate who's bringing what food. My aunt was asking about gift ideas. My brother was making jokes about free alcohol, and everyone seemed to have forgotten or chosen to ignore what had happened just weeks earlier. That's when I realized something crucial. They'd moved on because it hadn't hurt them, because it wasn't their dignity that had been shredded in front of everyone, because they had the luxury of forgetting while I was still bleeding from the wound. When someone directly asked if I was coming to the engagement party, I felt every eye in that digital space turn toward me, even though I was sitting alone in my apartment. My heart was racing, my palms were sweating, and I felt that familiar pressure to just say yes, to show up and play nice and pretend everything was fine because that's what kept the peace. That's what good family members did. But then I remembered how it felt to stand in that backyard, humiliated and alone, and I remembered the promise I'd made to myself that night, and I typed 3 words that felt like both an ending and a beginning. I won't be attending. The response in the group chat was immediate and chaotic. Question marks flooded my screen, followed by messages asking if I was okay, if something was wrong, if I had other plans, as if there had to be some external reason for my absence, rather than the obvious internal one. My mother called me within minutes, her voice tight with that particular combination of concern and frustration that mothers have perfected over millennia. She wanted to know what was going on, why I was making things difficult, whether this was about what happened at Grandma's party, and when I confirmed that yes, actually, it was entirely about what happened at Grandma's party, I could hear the deflation in her voice, that disappointed sigh that made me feel about 6 years old and in trouble for something I didn't fully understand. She told me I was being too sensitive, that Uncle Robert didn't mean anything by it, that he was just joking around like he always does, and that family was more important than hurt feelings. Each excuse felt like another small betrayal, another confirmation that my pain didn't matter as much as maintaining the illusion of family unity. I tried to explain how deeply his words had hurt me, how humiliated I'd felt, how much it meant that no one had defended me, but she kept circling back to the same arguments. Family is family. We have to forgive. We have to move past things. We can't hold grudges forever. And besides, did I really want to miss my cousin's engagement party over something so small? That word, small, echoed in my head long after we hung up. What felt like a defining moment of hurt and disrespect to me was categorized as small and insignificant by her, and that disconnect made me feel even more alone than I'd felt in that backyard. Over the next few days, I received calls and texts from various family members, each one trying a different approach to get me to change my mind. My aunt tried the guilt route, talking about how family should stick together and how my absence would hurt my cousin on her special day. My brother tried humor, making jokes about me being dramatic and needing to develop thicker skin. Even my grandmother called, her elderly voice making me feel like the worst person in the world for even considering missing family events, reminding me that life is short, and family is all we have, and someday I'll regret this distance I'm creating. But the person I didn't hear from was my Uncle Robert, the one whose words had started all of this. And I realized he probably didn't even remember what he'd said, that it had been so casual and insignificant to him that it didn't even register as something that might require an apology. That realization hurt almost as much as the original incident because it meant my pain was so invisible to him that he couldn't even see it enough to acknowledge it. The guilt was overwhelming, I won't lie about that. I was raised to believe that family was sacred, that blood was thicker than water, that you showed up for family no matter what, and here I was violating every single one of those unspoken rules. I lay awake at night questioning myself, wondering if I was being too harsh, too unforgiving, too sensitive like they all said. Maybe I should just go to the party, I thought. Maybe I should be the bigger person, let it go, move on, stop making such a big deal out of nothing. But every time I came close to giving in, I'd remember how it felt to be mocked in front of everyone I loved. And I'd remember that no one, not one single person, had stood up for me. And I'd remember that this wasn't just about one incident, but about years of subtle dismissals and minimizations and being made to feel like my choices and my career and my life were somehow less valid than everyone else's. So I didn't go to the engagement party, and I didn't respond to the increasingly aggressive messages asking why I was being so stubborn and selfish. Instead, I turned off my phone for the weekend, worked on a new campaign for another client I'd recently signed, went for long walks in the park near my apartment, and tried to rediscover who I was when I wasn't constantly defending myself or seeking approval from people who weren't willing to give it. The aftermath of missing the engagement party was worse than I'd anticipated, but also strangely clarifying. The family group chat that had once been filled with daily updates and random memes suddenly went quiet when I was active, and I could tell they'd created a separate chat without me where they were probably discussing my behavior and my attitude and my apparent transformation into the family black sheep. My mother stopped calling as frequently, and when we did talk, there was a coolness in her voice that hadn't been there before, a distance that felt both intentional and painful. She'd mentioned things that happened at the party, little stories and funny moments, and there was an edge to her tone that seemed to say, "See what you missed, see what you gave up, see what your stubbornness cost you." But what she didn't understand, what none of them understood, was that I hadn't given up anything I actually had. I'd stopped reaching for something that was never really being offered to me in the first place. The most challenging part wasn't the guilt or the pressure or even the sense of loss. It was the internal battle I fought with myself every single day. Society conditions us, especially women, to be peacemakers, to prioritize relationships over personal boundaries, to sacrifice our own comfort for the sake of keeping everyone else happy. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to apologize, to show up, to make things right, even though I logically knew that I wasn't the one who needed to make things right, that I was the injured party, that I deserved an apology, an acknowledgement, and respect that I'd never received. I found myself constantly second-guessing my decision, lying in bed at night and running through scenarios in my head. What if I was being too dramatic? What if I was throwing away relationships over something that didn't matter? What if I regretted this someday when it was too late to repair the damage? These thoughts circled endlessly, vultures feeding on my insecurity and my ingrained need to be liked and accepted by the people who'd known me longest. I talked to my best friend Sarah about it, someone who'd heard countless stories about my family dynamics over the years, and she asked me a question that completely reframed everything. If this was happening to me, if my family treated me the way yours treats you, what would you tell me to do? I thought about it, really thought about it, and I realized that if Sarah told me her family publicly humiliated her and then acted like she was the problem for being hurt about it, I'd tell her to run, to protect herself, to recognize that love shouldn't feel like constant criticism and judgment, and having to prove your worth over and over again. I'd tell her she deserved better, that real family lifts you up instead of tearing you down, that blood relation doesn't give anyone the right to treat you poorly without consequences. And yet here I was, holding myself to a completely different standard, accepting from my family what I'd never accept from anyone else, allowing them to treat me in ways I'd never allow a friend or partner or colleague to treat me. Why did I think I deserved less just because we shared DNA? That question unlocked something in me, some deep understanding that this wasn't about one incident at one party, but about a lifetime of being told, in both subtle and obvious ways, that who I was and what I did wasn't quite good enough, wasn't quite respectable enough, wasn't quite worthy of the same pride and celebration they showed for everyone else's achievements. I thought about my cousin Jennifer's law school graduation, how the entire family had thrown her a massive party, how my uncle had given a speech about how proud he was, how everyone had toasted to her success and her bright future. I thought about my brother's promotion at his engineering firm, how my parents had taken him out to an expensive dinner and bragged to everyone they knew. And then I thought about when I'd landed my first major client 3 years ago, how I'd excitedly shared the news at a family dinner, and how my uncle had responded with a comment about how anyone with a smartphone can do that these days, before changing the subject to something more interesting to him. The weeks turned into months, and I settled into a new normal that felt both liberating and lonely. I missed my grandmother's birthday dinner in November, skipped Thanksgiving at my parents' house, and when the holiday season rolled around, I politely declined every invitation to family gatherings with increasingly less explanation because I'd learned that trying to make them understand was exhausting and ultimately futile. My business, ironically, was thriving in ways it never had before. Without the constant emotional drain of family drama and the mental energy required to defend myself and recover from their criticism, I had more creativity, more focus, more drive than ever before. I signed 3 more major clients, increased my rates because I finally believed I was worth what I was charging, hired a part-time assistant to help with the workload, and started getting invited to speak at digital marketing conferences about social media strategy. Every success felt like vindication, proof that I hadn't been crazy or delusional about my abilities and my career choice. But I won't pretend it didn't hurt, because it did, deeply and constantly. I'd see families together at restaurants during the holidays and feel a pang of loss for something I couldn't quite name. I'd watch movies or TV shows with their idealized versions of family gatherings and feel angry and sad and confused about why my reality was so different from what I'd been taught family was supposed to be. I'd scroll through social media and see cousins and siblings posting happy photos together, and I'd wonder what was wrong with me that I couldn't just let things go and rejoin the fold like nothing had happened. The guilt was persistent and insidious, showing up at unexpected moments. When I was successful at work and wanted to share it with someone who'd known me since childhood, when I was struggling and could have used family support, when I was simply lonely and craving that particular comfort that comes from people who've known you forever. But then I'd remember that the family I was mourning wasn't the family I actually had. It was the family I wished I had, the one that existed in my imagination where they celebrated my success and defended me when I was attacked and made me feel valued and seen and loved for exactly who I was. The real family, the actual people behind the idealized concept, had shown me repeatedly who they were and how they saw me, and I'd finally chosen to believe them instead of clinging to hope that they'd somehow transform into the people I needed them to be. Christmas was particularly hard because my mother called crying, begging me to come to Christmas dinner, telling me I was breaking her heart and tearing the family apart and being selfish and cruel. Her words cut deep, sharper than my uncle's mockery had been because they came wrapped in the language of love and maternal disappointment. She made me out to be the villain in this story, the ungrateful daughter who was punishing everyone for one small incident that I should have forgiven by now. What she didn't acknowledge, what she refused to see, was that she'd had countless opportunities to make this right, to have a conversation with her brother about how his words had hurt her daughter, to create space for healing and apology and reconciliation. But instead, she'd chosen to blame me for being hurt rather than addressing the people who'd done the hurting. That's when I realized something crucial about family dynamics and the roles we're assigned. In my family, I'd always been cast as the one who was supposed to be understanding, flexible, forgiving, and accommodating, while everyone else got to be exactly who they were without any expectation of change or growth or basic human decency. I was supposed to absorb their criticism and show up with a smile, supposed to let their mockery roll off my back, supposed to prioritize their comfort over my own well-being, supposed to be small and quiet and grateful for whatever scraps of acceptance they threw my way, and I was tired, exhausted down to my bones of playing that role. So I told my mother, as gently but firmly as I could, that I wouldn't be coming to Christmas dinner, that I needed them to understand why I was hurt, and that until someone, anyone, was willing to acknowledge what had happened and how it had affected me, I couldn't keep subjecting myself to more of the same treatment. She hung up on me, and we didn't speak again for 2 months. Those 2 months of complete silence from my mother were among the most difficult of my life, but they were also strangely peaceful in a way I hadn't anticipated. Without the constant pressure to explain myself, justify my boundaries, or defend my decision to protect my own mental health, I found a kind of quiet stability that had been missing for years. I spent Christmas alone in my apartment, working on a campaign for a client who needed materials ready for the new year. And while it wasn't the warm family gathering I'd grown up with, it also wasn't the anxiety-inducing minefield of judgment and criticism that those gatherings had become. I ordered Chinese takeout, watched old movies, and went to bed early. And the next morning I woke up without that familiar knot of dread in my stomach that always accompanied family events. It was in that silence, that absence of their voices and expectations and disappointments, that I began to really hear my own voice, my own needs, my own truth about what I wanted my life to look like and who I wanted in it. New Year's came and went, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose and direction in my work. I launched a podcast about social media marketing strategies, started offering online courses for small business owners who wanted to improve their digital presence, and connected with other professionals in my field who not only understood what I did, but respected and valued it. I built a community of people who celebrated each other's successes, who offered support during challenges, who understood that new and emerging careers were just as valid and important as traditional ones, and who never made me feel like I had to prove my worth or justify my existence. For the first time in my life, I was surrounding myself with chosen family rather than obligatory family, and the difference was profound. These were people who showed up for me, who defended me, who believed in me, who saw my potential and my value without needing me to constantly demonstrate it. And in that space of genuine support and respect, I flourished in ways I never had before. My business grew exponentially, my confidence soared, and I started to recognize that the version of myself I'd been around my family, that small, defensive, constantly apologizing version, wasn't who I actually was. It was who I'd been forced to become in order to survive in an environment that didn't appreciate me. The real me, the one who emerged when I wasn't being criticized and judged, was creative, confident, successful, and happy. It was a revelation that changed everything. This understanding that I'd been wearing a costume of inadequacy that my family had tailored for me, and I'd finally taken it off and discovered the person underneath. But of course, family dynamics are never simple, and just when I was settling into this new identity and this new life, the phone calls started again. It began with my aunt, the one who'd tried the guilt approach before, calling to tell me that my mother was heartbroken over our estrangement, and that I was being unreasonable by holding on to anger for so long. She didn't ask about my side of the story, didn't inquire about how I was doing or whether I was okay, didn't acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, there were valid reasons for my absence. Instead, she launched into a lecture about forgiveness and family obligations and how life is too short to hold grudges, all the while completely missing the point that this wasn't about holding a grudge, but about protecting myself from ongoing harm. I listened quietly, let her say her piece, and then I calmly explained that I wasn't asking for much. I wasn't demanding groveling apologies or dramatic gestures. I simply wanted acknowledgement that what happened at that birthday party was hurtful and inappropriate, and I wanted some indication that it wouldn't happen again. Her response was telling. She said I was making a big deal out of nothing, that Uncle Robert was just being Uncle Robert, and that I needed to develop a thicker skin if I wanted to be part of this family. There it was, that conditional acceptance. I could be part of the family if I was willing to endure their treatment without complaint, if I was willing to shrink myself and my feelings and my needs to accommodate their behavior. The call with my aunt was followed by similar calls from other relatives, each one trying a different tactic to get me to come back into the fold without anyone having to actually address the underlying issues or change their behavior in any meaningful way. My cousin Jennifer, surprisingly, was the one who came closest to understanding, though it took her a while to get there. She called me on a random Tuesday evening in February, and unlike the other calls I'd received, she didn't immediately launch into reasons why I should forgive and forget. Instead, she asked how I was doing, really doing, and there was something in her tone that sounded almost genuine. We talked for over an hour, and somewhere in that conversation, she admitted that she'd been thinking about what happened at the party, that she'd replayed her own words in her head, and that she was starting to see how hurtful they must have been. She didn't offer a full apology, not yet, but she asked questions, real questions about my work and my business and what I actually did all day. And for the first time in our entire lives, she seemed genuinely interested in understanding rather than judging. She told me about the pressures she felt in her own career, the constant need to prove herself in a male-dominated field, the imposter syndrome that followed her despite her obvious success. And I realized that maybe her criticism of my career had been less about me and more about her own fears and insecurities projected onto a safer target. We didn't solve everything in that conversation, but we cracked open a door that had been firmly closed, and she ended the call by saying she'd talk to her father about what had happened, though she couldn't promise he'd be receptive. I appreciated the honesty, and I appreciated even more that she didn't try to minimize my feelings or rush me toward reconciliation before I was ready. That conversation gave me hope that maybe not all the relationships in my family were beyond repair, that maybe some people were capable of growth and change and seeing beyond their own perspectives. But it also reinforced something important. I couldn't control whether they chose to understand or apologize or change their behavior. I could only control my own boundaries and my own choices about who I allowed into my life and under what conditions. My business hit a major milestone in March when one of my campaigns went viral, generating millions of impressions and leading to significant sales increases for my client. The success was featured in several marketing publications. I was interviewed for a popular business podcast, and my client was so thrilled they referred 3 other companies to me. It was the kind of achievement that I would have rushed to share with my family a year ago, desperately hoping they'd finally see the value in what I did, finally acknowledge that my career was legitimate and successful and worthy of pride. But this time, I didn't tell them, and the absence of that desperate need for their validation was its own kind of victory. I celebrated with Sarah and other friends, with colleagues who understood the significance of what I'd accomplished, with my assistant who'd worked hard to help make the campaign successful, and I didn't feel the hollow ache of missing family approval that I'd always felt before. I was learning, slowly but surely, that external validation from people who'd never understood me was worth far less than internal validation from knowing my own worth, and that the opinions of people who respected and understood what I did mattered infinitely more than the opinions of people who'd never tried to understand. This shift in perspective was profound and liberating. This recognition that I'd been giving power to the wrong people, that I'd been measuring my success by the standards of people who didn't understand success in the modern economy, that I'd been shrinking to fit into a box that was never meant to contain someone like me. Have you ever experienced that moment when you realize you've been living your life for other people's approval rather than your own happiness? It's disorienting and freeing all at once, like suddenly seeing clearly after years of looking through a distorted lens. The confrontation I'd been both dreading and hoping for finally came in late April, almost 8 months after the birthday party incident that had started everything. My mother called and asked if she could come visit me, just the 2 of us. No other family members, no agenda except talking. I was hesitant, protective of the peace I'd built in my life, but I also recognized that she was reaching out in a way she hadn't before, and I owed it to our relationship, or at least to the possibility of our relationship, to hear what she had to say. She came to my apartment on a Saturday afternoon, and I could see immediately that something was different about her. She looked tired, older somehow, and there was a vulnerability in her expression that I wasn't used to seeing. We sat in my living room with coffee cups between us like shields, and for a few minutes neither of us spoke, the silence heavy with all the things that had gone unsaid for months. Finally, she began to talk, and what came out wasn't what I'd expected. She told me that my absence from family events had affected her more than she'd realized it would, that she'd defended the family's behavior initially because that's what she'd always done, because maintaining peace had always been her job, because she'd been raised to believe that family harmony was more important than individual hurt. But she said that over the past months, especially during holidays when I wasn't there, she'd started to notice things she'd never paid attention to before. The way Uncle Robert dominated conversations and dismissed anyone who disagreed with him. The way Jennifer's success was celebrated while other people's achievements were minimized. The way certain family members seemed to have permission to be cruel or thoughtless, while others were expected to just accept it. She said she'd been talking to my grandmother, who at 80 years old had more clarity about family dynamics than my mother had given her credit for. And my grandmother had pointed out that the family had always had favorites and scapegoats, and that I'd been cast in the role of someone whose choices and achievements could be diminished without consequence. My mother's voice cracked when she told me she was sorry, really sorry, for not defending me that day in the backyard, for minimizing my hurt afterward, for making me feel like I was the problem rather than addressing the actual problem. She said she'd talked to Uncle Robert finally, And while he hadn't been particularly receptive at first, she'd persisted, explaining how his words had hurt me and driven me away from the family. She told me he'd eventually admitted that he'd been out of line, though she also warned me that he wasn't great at apologies and probably wouldn't offer one directly, but that he understood now that what he'd said wasn't acceptable. It wasn't the dramatic reckoning I'd sometimes fantasized about, where everyone gathered and acknowledged their mistakes and begged for my forgiveness. But it was something. And maybe something was all I could reasonably expect from imperfect people who were doing their best, even if their best had fallen painfully short. I listened to everything she said, and I felt the tension I'd been carrying for months start to loosen just slightly. Not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because someone had finally acknowledged that what happened was wrong, and that my hurt was valid and that I wasn't crazy or oversensitive for protecting myself. We talked for hours that afternoon, really talked, about family patterns and expectations and the roles we'd all been assigned, about how hard it is to break generational cycles of dysfunction, about the difference between forgiving and forgetting and how you can do one without necessarily doing the other. My mother asked if I'd consider coming to the next family gathering, my cousin's wedding scheduled for July, and I told her honestly that I didn't know yet, that I needed time to think about what boundaries I needed to have in place to protect myself, that I wasn't willing to go back to the way things were before. She nodded, understanding, or at least trying to understand, and she promised that she'd work on making family events safer spaces for everyone, though she acknowledged it was going to be a process and wouldn't change overnight. After my mother left, I sat with everything she'd said, turning it over in my mind like a complicated puzzle I was trying to solve. Part of me wanted to believe that this was the turning point, that acknowledgement and apology were the first steps toward real change and healthier family dynamics. But another part of me, the part that had been hurt too many times, was cautious, skeptical, protective of the peace I'd fought so hard to establish. I thought about what it would mean to attend the wedding in July, what boundaries I'd need to have in place, what I'd do if someone made another dismissive comment about my career or my choices. I realized that going back to family events couldn't mean going back to who I'd been before, that small, apologetic version of myself who absorbed criticism and sought approval. If I was going to reintegrate with my family, it had to be as the person I'd become in their absence. Confident, successful, clear about my worth, and unwilling to tolerate disrespect. Over the next few weeks, I had individual conversations with several family members, testing the waters, seeing if the awareness my mother had spoken about was genuine or just temporary. I talked to my grandmother, who in her wise way told me that families are complicated, that people make mistakes, and that the question isn't whether we're hurt by the ones we love, but how we respond to that hurt, and whether reconciliation is possible without sacrificing ourselves in the process. I talked to Jennifer again, and this time she did apologize, directly and specifically, for her comments at the party and for her general attitude of superiority over the years. She said she'd been doing some therapy work around her own insecurities and controlling behaviors, and she was trying to be more aware of how her words affected other people. I appreciated her apology, and I also recognized that people are capable of change when they're willing to do the work, when they're willing to look at themselves honestly and take responsibility for their impact on others. My Uncle Robert never did call me directly, which wasn't surprising, but my mother told me he'd agreed to be more respectful of different career paths and to think before making jokes at other people's expense. It wasn't a heartfelt apology, but it was an acknowledgement of sorts. And maybe that was all I'd get from him. I had to decide if that was enough, if I could accept imperfect apologies and incremental change rather than holding out for the dramatic transformation that probably wasn't realistic. As the wedding date approached, I made my decision. I would attend, but I'd do so with clear boundaries and an exit plan if those boundaries were violated. I wouldn't stay at the family house but would book my own hotel room. I wouldn't feel obligated to stay for the entire event if I became uncomfortable. I wouldn't engage in conversations about my career unless people approached the topic with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. And most importantly, I'd remember that my worth wasn't dependent on their approval, that I'd built a successful business and a fulfilling life without their validation, and that I was attending as a choice rather than an obligation. The wedding was beautiful, and I won't pretend it wasn't emotional to be back with family after so many months apart. There were awkward moments, uncomfortable silences, and a general sense that everyone was being careful around me, which was both appreciated and slightly frustrating because it meant we were all aware of the fracture even if we weren't directly addressing it. Uncle Robert did approach me at one point during the reception, and while he didn't explicitly apologize, he did ask about my business, and listened to my answers without interrupting or making dismissive comments, which for him was probably the closest thing to an apology I'd ever receive. Jennifer introduced me to her new colleagues as her cousin, who runs a successful social media marketing business, and the pride in her voice was something I'd never heard before. My mother stayed close throughout the event, protective in a way she hadn't been before, and I could see her watching interactions and intervening subtly when conversations started to veer into potentially problematic territory. It wasn't perfect, not even close, but it was different, and different felt like progress. The months following the wedding brought a new phase in my family relationships, one that I'd describe as cautiously optimistic but realistic. I started attending some family events again, but not all of them, and I didn't feel guilty about the ones I skipped. I maintained my boundaries firmly but kindly, and when someone occasionally slipped into old patterns of dismissiveness or criticism, I addressed it directly rather than swallowing my hurt and pretending everything was fine. It was uncomfortable at first. This new dynamic where I stood up for myself and called out behavior that wasn't acceptable, but it was also empowering in ways I hadn't anticipated. I discovered that most people, when confronted with specific feedback about how their words or actions affected me, were willing to adjust, even if they initially got defensive. The ones who weren't willing to adjust, I simply spent less time around, and I made peace with the fact that not every family relationship could or should be salvaged. My business continued to thrive, and I found that success without the weight of family disapproval felt lighter, cleaner, more genuinely mine. I spoke at several conferences throughout the year, my podcast gained a substantial following, and my courses helped hundreds of small business owners improve their digital presence and grow their revenue. I hired 2 more employees, moved into an actual office space instead of working from home, and started planning for expansion into coaching and consulting services. Every achievement felt earned and celebrated, no longer tainted by the desperate need for validation from people who'd never understood what I was building. I also started recognizing patterns in my own behavior, ways I'd been conditioned to seek approval and shrink myself, and I worked on unlearning those patterns through therapy and intentional practice. It's ongoing work, this journey of establishing healthy boundaries and maintaining self-worth in the face of people who'd spent years teaching me I wasn't enough, but it's work that's fundamentally changed my life for the better. I learned that loving your family doesn't mean accepting mistreatment, that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or exposing yourself to ongoing harm, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to create distance from relationships that diminish you. I also learned that people are capable of change when they're motivated to do so, when they see the real consequences of their behavior, and when someone they love is willing to hold them accountable even when it's uncomfortable. Not everyone changed, and not every relationship was repaired, but enough did and enough were that I could find my way back to some version of family connection without sacrificing the person I'd become in their absence. The little girl inside me who'd wanted her family's approval finally grew up and realized she didn't need it, and that realization was both painful and freeing. Today, my relationship with my family is different than it was, and it's different than it might have been if I'd never set those boundaries and demanded respect. It's not the close, warm, unconditionally supportive family dynamic I'd once hoped for, but it's honest and it's sustainable, and it doesn't require me to betray myself to maintain it. Some family members and I are closer now than we've ever been, because we've done the hard work of real communication and mutual respect. Others remain distant, and I've accepted that some relationships are better loved from afar. My mother and I have rebuilt our connection on a foundation of honesty rather than peacekeeping, and while it's sometimes uncomfortable, it's also more authentic than it's ever been. My grandmother, in her final years, told me she was proud of me for standing up for myself, that she wished she'd done the same when she was younger, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give to future generations is breaking the cycles that kept previous generations small and silent. So here's what I want you to understand from my story. What I hope you'll take away if you're struggling with similar family dynamics or questioning whether you have the right to protect yourself from people who claim to love you while treating you poorly. You are not obligated to accept mistreatment from anyone, regardless of your relationship to them. Blood relation doesn't grant people permission to diminish you, criticize you, or make you feel less than. Your career choices, your life path, your decisions are valid even if your family doesn't understand or approve of them, and you don't need their validation to know your worth. Setting boundaries with family is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, because we're conditioned from birth to prioritize family harmony over our own needs. But I promise you that protecting your peace and your mental health is not selfish, it's necessary. The guilt will be overwhelming, especially at first, because you're going against years of conditioning that tells you family should always come first. But that guilt is not a reliable indicator of whether you're doing the right thing. Sometimes the right thing feels terrible because it's unfamiliar and it disrupts the status quo that others have benefited from maintaining. You might lose some relationships, and that will hurt, but you'll also discover which relationships are worth keeping, which people are capable of growth and change, and which connections can survive honest communication and accountability. You'll learn that the family you choose, the people who genuinely support and celebrate you, are sometimes more valuable than the family you were born into, and there's no shame in investing your energy in relationships that actually nourish you rather than drain you. Your absence from family events will make some people uncomfortable, and they'll try to make you the villain in their story because accepting that their behavior drove you away would require them to look at themselves honestly. And not everyone is willing or able to do that work. Let them be uncomfortable. Their discomfort is not your responsibility to manage. You deserve to be celebrated, not just tolerated. You deserve to have your achievements recognized rather than minimized. You deserve to be in spaces where you don't have to constantly defend your choices or prove your worth. And if your family can't or won't provide that, you have every right to create distance until they can, and if they never can, you have every right to build your life around people who see you, value you, and treat you with the respect every human being deserves. The story I've shared with you today isn't just about one incident at one party. It's about a lifetime of small cuts that finally bled enough that I couldn't ignore them anymore. And it's about the journey of learning to value myself enough to demand better treatment even from the people who raised me. It's about discovering that self-respect and family connection aren't mutually exclusive, but sometimes establishing one requires temporarily stepping away from the other, and that's okay. It's about understanding that real love, family love, should feel safe and supportive, not like walking through a minefield where you never know when the next explosion will come. And it's about the profound relief that comes from finally choosing yourself, choosing your peace, choosing your mental health, even when everyone around you is telling you that choice is wrong or selfish or unforgiving. I want you to know that if you're going through something similar, you're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not being too sensitive. Your feelings are valid, your hurt is real, and you have every right to protect yourself. Have you ever been through something similar with your family? Have you had to set boundaries that others didn't understand? I'd love to hear your story in the comments below, because sharing these experiences reminds us that we're not alone in these struggles. That family dysfunction is far more common than we like to admit, and that there's incredible strength in choosing yourself even when it costs you relationships you once thought were unbreakable. If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen or understood or less alone in your own family struggles, please leave a like on this video because it helps me reach more people who might need to hear this message. Subscribe to Living Through It for more real, honest, unfiltered stories about navigating difficult relationships, setting boundaries, and choosing yourself without apology. Because we're building a community here of people who understand that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from situations and relationships that diminish you. And there's no shame in that bravery, only strength and wisdom and self-love that will serve you for the rest of your life. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story. And remember that your worth is not determined by other people's inability to see it. Your success is not less valid because it doesn't fit traditional definitions, and your right to protect your peace is not negotiable regardless of who's asking you to compromise it. Thank you for being here, thank you for listening, and thank you for being part of this community where we choose healing over harmony, authenticity over approval, and ourselves over obligations that no longer serve us.